Kia ora koutou, ko Nick toko ingoa. I live on 2.7 hectares in the Wairarapa in New Zealand, and for the last few years I've been trying to produce or grow my own kai or food through an annual vegetable garden, a food forest and raising livestock. With my vegetable garden, I'm trying to close the loop a bit more, and by this I mean saving crops that were grown here on this land and then repeating the cycle in the following year. So rather than buying in all of my seeds every year to grow vegetables, I'm trying to save some seeds so I can then use varieties grown here for the next year. And so I've been successful in saving a few seed varieties, but one thing I really wanted to try that was a bit different was potatoes. And so normally I'd buy in seed potatoes locally year after year, but I wanted to start to close that loop as well and see if I could just repeat the cycle year after year with the varieties I grow here. So this video is my attempt to save seed potatoes and see if it worked. So last year I purchased a couple of varieties of potato locally as seed potatoes. The first was Rocket, which is like an early crop new potato that grows pretty fast. And then the second variety was Desire, which is a red-skinned potato that was said to have good storage. And that really appealed to me, considering it was my main crop, and if I had an abundance, I wanted to be able to store it for as long as possible, and it would also store well, hopefully, to become a seed potato. So in the middle of summer, I harvested most of my potatoes, and it was a really wet season, so not a good year with susceptibility to things like rot and disease, but I was pleasantly surprised with my potato harvest, and I think because of the varieties I chose, they seemed to go pretty well. So once I'd harvested my potatoes, I selected a few to be seed potatoes, and I picked ones that were blemish free and looked completely disease free, as when I stored them I didn't want anything to spread to the other potatoes. I left majority of the dirt on because this is said to help with storage rather than scrubbing them and cleaning them. And then I did a bit of a internet search to see what the best way would be to store my potatoes. And probably the method I was most convinced by was storing potatoes in sand. So what I did was get a small bucket or tub, and I filled this up with sand, then one by one put my selected seed potatoes in the sand, and I made sure none of the potatoes were touching one another so they didn't infect one another or cause any issues if they were to arise. And then I covered the potatoes in sand, and what was suggested to really help with the longevity was actually to make the sand slightly damp, so not soaking or really wet, but just a bit damp. And I think what this enabled is the potatoes to store better, so the sand didn't suck all the moisture out of the potatoes, so they didn't completely wither up and not store so well. So the damp sand meant it could be like a happy little environment for them. Then I simply moved this container into the garage, which is a really cool, dry, dark place. That's really important. If it was too hot, it might cause the potatoes to sprout early. If it was too damp, it might encourage things like disease. So a cool, dry area, I think, is crucial for storage. So then all I did was wait. Then come September, it was getting about time to put my early variety, the Rocket, in. So I took the potatoes in their sand out of storage, and I was really pleasantly surprised to see how well they'd all stored. So there were a few that were quite withered, so maybe the sand could have been even a bit more damp, and certainly the Desire did appear to store better than the Rocket. I had fewer casualties, and I expected this given that they were said to be good for this very thing. Sorry, the wind's just picking up, so I'm going to change spot. Okay, hopefully this spot's a bit better for the wind. But anyway, all in all, the sand storage method for potatoes seemed to work, so I can vouch for that. So then the next step was to see if I could get these seed potatoes that I'd saved to actually grow. So growing potatoes in my particular soil type is somewhat challenging, and this is because I have this wonderfully free draining soil, which means it's full of rocks, and potatoes are not a big fan of rocks. So it's quite labour intensive to grow potatoes for me, because I have to dig out the beds, these reasonably deep trenches, and remove as many rocks as I can. And so once the rocks are removed, I then mix in some compost with the soil, and then make little indentations in the beds where I put the seed potatoes. And you'll see the seed potatoes have these little shoots that are growing off them, and I just try and keep these buried under the soil. And so once I have the seed potatoes in the new beds, I then cover them with soil about 5 or 10 centimetres. And then once I'd covered the potatoes, I added a bit of straw and watered them in with some good old seaweed tonic. And then I wait, let nature decide when they sprout, and then once the potatoes sprout the first of their foliage, I will then cover it with more soil and straw again. And this is just to ensure that the potatoes are growing really deep into the soil, which I believe should get me a better yield, rather than if they're too close to the surface, where if they're in contact with sunlight they can go green and then be inedible. And on occasion I would feed them with a little bit of my own homemade liquid fertilizer. Now for the early potatoes, I did have a few challenges, and I potentially laid them out a bit early, but we did have really late frosts this year, later than usual. And so of course the frosts would happen when I'd be away or something, or just about to go away. So I'd either have to get, friends, or rush out and cover the potatoes as best I could. And I used things like sheets and plastic and more mulch and hay to protect them. But despite my best efforts, they still did get somewhat damaged. All in all though, the potatoes did bounce back and their green foliage came through, and once we passed the frosts, they appeared to be growing really, really well. So then come December, just before Christmas, I was ready to test to see if the potatoes had grown successfully. And so I dug into the first few plants, and even the smaller plants appear to have a really decent yield of potatoes underneath them. And there's nothing sweeter than those first new potatoes of the season. They're just so buttery and sweet and beautiful, boiled with a bit of mint and butter. And so all in all, saving seed potatoes with the sand method really worked for me, and grew into these lovely potatoes that I can now save year round. And so come later on in summer, I'll harvest the last of some of these potatoes and use the same method to store them again. And this is brilliant because it means I can just repeat that loop and that cycle over and over again with the varieties that I know work for me, without having to buy in seed potatoes. So I hope it was helpful for me to share my experience of saving seed potatoes and growing them, and I hope if you give it a try, it also works for you. But I'll repeat this in the seasons to come and see if it keeps working. But as far as this first year's gone, it's successfully worked for my spuds. So if you've watched this video, thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your summer and enjoy the harvests. Ka kite, anō.